let's recap all the ways you heard about how you can use the Language Alchemy podcast to start building your own transformative communication toolbox. Number 1, notice what you need in your life and relationships and choose an episode that speaks to you. Number 2, don't have time to listen? No problem. Read the titles to raise your awareness about communication. Number 3, listen to the podcast weekly. Let the tools integrate within you and then mix and match them to help others, especially if you're a coach, a therapist, or in a position in which others come to you for help. Number 4, share the podcast as a useful resource with others and let them know how accessible it is so they can build their own transformative communication toolbox. Number 5, listen to the podcast and uncover one communication tool you need to work on and give yourself the time and space to go deep with it. Number 6, listen to the podcast to change your life and relationships. And number 7, when you're having some difficulties or experiencing disconnection in a relationship, use a transformative communication tool from the podcast right away to bring ease and restore connection.
I don't like to argue, so I say nothing and fume for days.
How do I set boundaries without sounding like a jerk?
I hate the idea that I might accidentally offend somebody, so sometimes I'd just rather say nothing at all.
Welcome to the Language Alchemy podcast, and thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra, a transformative communication teacher and coach devoted to helping you have more peace and more harmony in all your relationships. Today, I want to share with you about a great communication toolbox you have right here in this very podcast. I am going to talk about 7 different ways to use this podcast so that you can build your own transformative communication toolbox. You're also going to hear great and surprising ways in which other listeners are using this podcast. And in the end, I'll talk about a resource I put together for you so that when you have a particular communication issue, you can use the tools from this podcast to help you communicate with clarity, confidence, and compassion. So how can you use the Language Alchemy podcast as your transformative communication toolbox? Well, let me share with you how some listeners are using it. These listeners came to the first year anniversary podcast party. First, listen to how Rebecca uses the podcast.
Hey, Alejandra, it's Rebecca. I just wanted to say that what I really appreciate about your podcasts is that it is such an array of subjects that I can pick and choose those that appeal to me, that speak to me. It's just great because it's so convenient and you're concise, and I just thoroughly enjoy the ones that I get to hear.
Like Rebecca, you can build your transformative communication toolbox by noticing your needs and then choosing a relevant episode. To connect to your needs, you can ask yourself, what's happening in my life and relationships right now? And how can I enhance, heal, or support my life and relationships? You can use these 2 questions to guide you to get the communication tools you need in the moment. Another way to use this podcast as a communication toolbox and to use it in a creative way is to do what Karen does. And this way doesn't include listening. What? Yes, listen for yourself.
Alejandra, I just really want to thank you so much for this work that you're doing. It's incredibly important to reach as many people as you are to raise the consciousness of how we communicate with each other. And for myself personally, just even reading the titles of just knowing what you're saying, what you're putting out, has lifted up my own awareness of every one of my communications with everyone. I have a deeper awareness of it and consciousness of it. And also my observation of how other people communicate. and where it begins to break down and some of the problems and the courage it takes for myself personally to rise up to speak my truth.
Isn't that creative? You can use the podcast like Karen does. And if you only have a few minutes, you can just read the list of titles. Reading the titles alone can raise your awareness about communication. What I love about what Karen shared is that if you don't have the time to listen, you don't have to. And you can still get ideas of the transformative communication tools that you would like to add to your toolbox. And that way, when you do have the time, you can come back to the podcast and listen to a specific episode. A third way to get the most out of the podcast is to help others build their own transformative communication toolbox. This is especially useful if you're a coach, a counselor, a leader of sorts, if you work with people, or if you're a therapist like Ellen, who is a loyal listener and also my dear mother-in-law, or mother-in-love, as I like to call her. Listen to how Ellen uses the podcast.
I am amazed when your podcast comes across my screen that the subject is so relevant to whatever is happening that week, that month in the country, in the world. I feel like, well, I know you have some divine instincts, but I keep thinking, how does this come to her to be so in tune with what is so relevant and what we need so much? So I had an experience today, which I think it encompassed maybe 6 of your podcasts. I had to coach a patient of mine to enter into a communication with a dear friend of hers. And it was going to be an extremely difficult conversation. And it needed everything that you've said about leaving space and room for the different points of view, not being judgmental, identifying your own prejudices so they don't get in the way, and above all, showing compassion. It was such a difficult communication because I was trying to help this person to go into a communication with another person, but I drew on everything that you have taught me, and I'm really grateful for that.
So you see, another way you can use this podcast to build your transformative communication toolbox is by subscribing to it every week, listen to it every week. So every week you're picking up tools and letting these tools integrate within you. So much so that when the moment comes, you can mix and match them and support others in their communication. And speaking of helping others build their own transformative communication toolbox, I'd like you to know that you don't have to be a therapist, a coach, or a leader. You can just be a caring human or a loving friend or family member, and you can use this podcast like Shannon does. This is the 4th way to use the podcast.
Hey, Alejandra, Shannon. I wanted to say how much I appreciate being able to share your podcast with strangers on social media. I'm in a lot of support groups on Facebook, and the issue of communication comes up a lot. And it's really helpful to be able to be like, hey, folks, here's some, easy, accessible things to dive into. I've also shared your podcast with my entire family, my sister's in-laws, friends, all sorts of people who I think could benefit from your insight. So I really appreciate you making that so widely available and so accessible. I have a hard time getting into a lot of podcasts because the content is often so long. Like some of these podcasts are like an hour and a half, 2 hours long. And I'm like, do I really have that much time to dive into one topic, And so the fact that your episodes are shorter and more accessible really, I think, makes that barrier to people getting into the information that you have to share a lot easier. So I really appreciate all of that. Of course, I appreciate you and all of your wisdom and everything you've done for me and my family over the years. So thank you so much.
See, another way you can use the podcast is by listening to it and then sharing it with others so that others can build their own transformative communication toolbox. A fifth way would be that sometimes it would be useful for you to go deep in your exploration of one transformative communication tool, just like Tara mentions here.
Alejandra, I feel like your podcast is really a balm for the soul, and it's so heart-centric, and it's something that we really need right now with everything going on in the world. And so it's good to see ourselves in the podcast. I know an episode that really spoke to me was about not being as much of a reactive listener in relationships. And it's something that I'm really working on. And I never sort of heard it framed that way.
So you can use the podcast to uncover an important tool you need to develop, refine, or polish, and use that discovery as the springboard from which you do the deep work you need to do with that particular communication tool. When you go deep with one tool, and like Tara says, it takes time, but it will transform the way you communicate. And remember, when we transform the way we communicate, we transform our lives and relationships. And don't take my word for it. Listen to how another listener used the podcast to transform his life.
I have a client who's told me that he was Googling me and he came across the podcast in which we were talking. And so he listened to the podcast and then he started listening to the other podcasts. And he said that it completely changed his approach to relationship, to communication. He started doing yoga. He's completely changed his life. And
yes, so you can get ideas from the podcast about all the tools you need, and you can start exploring all those tools simultaneously and then see what results you're getting. And finally, number 7. A very useful way to build your communication toolbox through the Language Alchemy podcast is to listen to a relevant episode when you are having a particular communication issue. Listen to what Rami did and how the podcast supported her.
And I started looking into the content of your blog, your podcast, and I'm like, oh, one day I might use it, I think. And it happened like weeks ago. I was in my honeymoon. And I had some strong feelings that I couldn't express. I blocked myself totally. And it was just the beginning of the honeymoon. How could that happen? And I'm like, I need to find something. So I started praying because when that incident happened, my husband slept on the other room. And I'm like, I need to find a way. So please send me a sign, send me something. And I'm like, hey, what about the communication coach? So I started looking, and the podcast that helped me a lot was the one where your husband was part of. And you were talking about how to be empathic. And what I took from it was to speak from your heart. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to do this. So I reached out to my husband and I talked to him, and we were able to clear what was happening to me. And I find myself in many situations like that. I mean, in ways like that. But I'm like, okay, now I find tools. I find ways. So I want to thank you. Thank you for putting this information out there, for making it so relevant. It's true. And for making it so easy to put in practice.
Rami applied a transformative communication tool from a podcast episode right away. Applying the tools from the podcast right away brought her the connection she wanted to have with her new husband and also helped her enjoy the rest of her honeymoon. So there you have it. 7 different ways to use the Language Alchemy podcast to build your transformative communication toolbox. And I actually want to give you one more, a bonus one. It's a resource I put together for you to help you match specific communication issues with transformative communication tools from the podcast. But before I tell you more about this resource, let's recap all the ways you heard about how you can use the Language Alchemy podcast to start building your own transformative communication toolbox. Number 1, notice what you need in your life and relationships and choose an episode that speaks to you. Number 2, don't have time to listen? No problem. Read the titles to raise your awareness about communication. Number 3, listen to the podcast weekly. Let the tools integrate within you and then mix and match them to help others, especially if you're a coach, a therapist, or in a position in which others come to you for help. Number 4, share the podcast as a useful resource with others and let them know how accessible it is so they can build their own transformative communication toolbox. Number 5, listen to the podcast and uncover one communication tool you need to work on and give yourself the time and space to go deep with it. Number 6, listen to the podcast to change your life and relationships. And number 7, when you're having some difficulties or experiencing disconnection in a relationship, use a transformative communication tool from the podcast right away to bring ease and restore connection. So many ways, right? And perhaps you are using the podcast in other ways. If so, I'd love for you to share with us how. It would be such a generous gift to share so that others can benefit too. And remember, we're still celebrating the first year of the Language Alchemy podcast until August 15. And if you share how you're using the podcast or what you'd like me to address in year 2, not only will you be helping others, but you will also enter a raffle to win various communication prizes, including a 1-hour communication coaching session with me. Go to languagealchemy.com/podcast anniversary to share and participate in the raffle. I will add the link in the show notes, and I'll say it again just in case too. languagealchemy.com/podcast anniversary. And no, I did not forget. I told you I had an extra free resource for you. I put together a transformative communication toolkit to help you with specific communication issues. And how will you get it? I will email it to you. If you'd like to receive it, and I can guarantee you will be a very valuable resource, go to languagealchemy.com and sign up to my mailing list. And if you already are on my mailing list, of course you will receive the Transformative Communication Toolkit by August 15th. And if you aren't, and you'd like to receive this Transformative Communication Toolkit, go to languagealchemy.com and sign up for my mailing list. Once again, the link is languagealchemy.com, and I'll add the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to all the language alchemists who attended the anniversary podcast party. You inspire me to renew my commitment to do all I can to bring forth more peace, more love, and more equity to our lives through transformative communication. Until next week, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao!